Hello. So we're going to continue looking at the whole concept of labor productivity and the reasons as to why it is very important in terms of us understanding why an economy grows over time. And one of the things as to why we are particularly interested in understanding labor and its impact on output is that labor in and of itself is the resource that is most responsible for increasing labor productivity is capital. Capital and its impact on labor output is very direct. And what it is saying to you is that as economies accumulate more capital per worker, labor productivity is going to increase. And when we speak of capital, there are basically two broad categories. One, human capital, and the other being physical capital. And the concept of human capital is one that you should basically understand quite easily. Human capital basically refers to the accumulation of knowledge, skills, and experience of the labor force. So the mere fact, for instance, that you're here as a student at Abbott doing albeit economics, accounting, or whatever the case may be, that's basically because you want to increase your human capital. You're gaining knowledge, you're gaining skills, so that you can basically deploy these knowledge factors on the job site. Human capital, he says here that the more human capital you have, the higher would be the level of productivity. Okay, so ever so often, persons who find themselves employed will go and retool themselves, because in retooling themselves, you're getting more human capital. You'll be able to add greater value to whichever institution you work for. The next one speaks to physical capital, and that physical capital again refer to those investments that we use in macroeconomics. So physical capital basically includes the machinery, building, roads, airports, communication network, and other manufactured creation used to produce goods and services. So note the distinction between human capital and physical capital, because I'll give you a cue now. You're going to be expecting to know these when it comes to your midterm assessment. So having looked at the human capital and the physical capital, now we're going to look at the per worker production function, and that's basically slide 9 of the chapter. And that per worker production function, it basically shows you the relationship between the amount of capital per worker in the economy and the average output per worker. So what you have before you is a function, a graphical representation which slope upwards, showing you then that there's a direct or there's a positive relationship between the amount of capital per worker and the output that worker in the economy. So the chart basically shows you that what? At any point on that production function, you can then have some level of output based on the amount of capital that you would have deployed per worker. So, just to explain, at point K, for instance, when there are K units of capital per worker, the average output per worker is said to be Y. And the next sub-bullet is saying to you that it is an upward slope because an increase in capital per worker helps each worker produce more output. So again, there is that positive relationship between capital per worker and output per worker. But interestingly, you'll note that there isn't just a straight line. There's not a one-to-one relationship between capital per worker and output per worker. Because what comes into being is that whole concept called diminishing marginal returns. All right, and those of you, again, who would have done microeconomics would have been exposed to the concept of diminishing returns, whereby it is saying to you is that as you add more to a given factor, eventually the level of output would increase, but at a decreasing rate at some point. So that's what the law of diminishing returns is saying to you in this context, whereby as you add more capital per worker, the output per worker is going to increase, but eventually it's going to do so at a decreasing rate. So if we were to now move to slide 11, where we're going to talk about that per worker production function, we're saying again that the shape of the per worker production function, it reflects the law of diminishing marginal returns. And in a nutshell, what we're saying to you is that when applied to capital, says that the more capital per worker there is already, the less additional output can be gained by increasing the capital stock per worker even more. So eventually, as capital increases, output per worker is going to decrease. And having said that, we then come across to a very important concept called capital deepening. And in a nutshell, what we're saying to you is that as we increase the amount of capital per worker, we are engaged in a concept called capital deepening. Okay, an increase in the amount of capital per worker is called capital deepening. So let's say again we're talking about capital and output. What would happen if you have a situation whereby there is some form of technological breakthrough? How would that impact the output per worker? There is some technology breakthrough, some new way of doing things. What's going to happen? If that's the case, technology basically is going to improve the quality of capital. And by virtue of that improvement, it simply means then that the output per worker is going to increase. All right? So simply put, let's say you have a situation whereby you're working on a farm. The farm was using, let's say, a hoe, as the case may be. But all of a sudden, the farmer choose to go the route of mechanizing his farm. It simply means then that with that mechanization, the amount of output that can be produced is going to increase. So simply put, as technology improves, that same level amount of labor is going to increase the amount of output per worker. So an increase in the level of technology is going to cause an upward rotation. And notice I said rotation in the production frontier. All right? It doesn't shift, unlike what we have with regard to, for instance, our consumption function. It rotates from a point where the x and the y axis would have intersect upwards. So there's an upward rotation in your production function if you have a situation whereby technology has improved. So let's look at the whole concept of economic growth. And you say here that two kinds of changes in capital improve worker productivity. Okay? The first one is an increase in the quantity of capital per worker. And remember, we discussed the whole concept of shift and movements. Well, because we have capital per worker on your x-axis and output per worker on your y-axis, Any change in the capital per worker will then cause a movement along our per worker production function. So as we move from the left to the right in terms of capital per worker, if we increase the quantity of capital per worker, output per worker is going to increase, productivity is going to increase. An improvement in the quality now on the flip side is reflective of changes in technology that is going to create a rotation in the curve upwards. So again, all things equal, when we talk about our production frontier, we have to keep then technology constant, because technology, for instance, would then create a rotation in the production function. How then do the rules of the game impact productivity and growth? So we have already spoken about it in the initial side when we introduced the concept. The rules of the game, again, that refers to the formal and informal institution that promote economic activity. It speaks to the laws, customs, convention, and other institutional elements that encourage people to undertake productive activity. We've already spoken about them. Stable political environment and systems of well-defined property rights. So if you have a situation whereby an economy is experiencing a lot of turmoil, naturally there's some political instability. People, firms, investors are not going to be inclined to go into those economies that have unstable political environment. The next one speaks to improvements in the rules of the games that could result in more output for each level of capital that will cause then an upward rotation in our per worker production function. So you can see then it's very important then for the socio-political environment to be stable if we want to have growth in an economy. The next slide basically shows you how world economies would have grown over time, and naturally we talk about the industrial markets such as the USA and other, well, first world countries, as they're saying, is that these economies basically account for 20% of the world's population. They are the first to experience long-term economic growth because by and large is that when we had the Industrial Revolution, it took place in places like Great Britain, in the US, etc., as the case may be. So they basically were the first to experience long-term economic growth. And also now we have what's called developing countries, countries in Africa, the Caribbean, as the case may be. They account for 80% of the world's population. And it says here that majority of the workers in these economies are employed in agriculture. I mean, we may be factual maybe 10, 15 years ago, but with the advent of technology and the services, with more economies becoming more service-based, certainly in the developed world, you may not necessarily find quite a lot of persons employed in agriculture, as the book probably has it. We also have another group within those two groups, and that's what's called emerging market economies. And these emerging market economies are basically economies that are making that transition from being a developing economy to, again, an emerging market economy that would then eventually graduate them probably to the industrialized economy. So you have countries like Brazil, you have India, Russia, and so forth that tend to be called emerging market economies. So we're going to end here on slide 15. This is going to represent part 2 of our lecture on productivity and growth, and then we're going to go into slide 16, which will then deal with education and its impact on economic development.